Welcome back to Vocabulary Boost. I'm Leo.
And I'm Clara. Today we're diving into episode 4 of our series on mastering 1,000 English words in 30 days.
In our previous episodes, we've covered the science behind vocabulary acquisition, powerful tech tools, and contextual learning strategies. Today we're exploring something I'm particularly excited about: memory techniques and mnemonic systems specifically adapted for vocabulary learning.
Oh, I'm so thrilled about this topic. These techniques have absolutely transformed my own vocabulary learning journey. Just last week, I remembered the word pulchritudinous in a conversation because of a ridiculous memory palace image I created.
Pulchritudinous? That's an impressive word. And that's exactly the power of the techniques we're discussing today. They make even the most challenging words stick in your memory.
Absolutely. Today we'll be covering the memory palace technique for vocabulary, the keyword method, visual association strategies, chunking and grouping approaches, linking and story techniques, using rhythm and music, and how to combine these methods for maximum impact.
These are powerful tools that can dramatically improve your word retention and recall speed. So shall we dive right in? Let's start with the memory palace technique, which is one of the most powerful mnemonic systems available for vocabulary learning.
I love the memory palace. For those who aren't familiar, this technique, also called the method of loci, involves associating words with specific locations in a familiar place, like your home or a route you walk regularly.
Exactly. This method has actually been used since ancient Greek and Roman times, and memory champions still use it today to perform remarkable feats like memorizing entire decks of cards.
But how do we adapt it specifically for vocabulary learning? I mean, words are abstract, especially compared to images of playing cards.
That's a great question. The key is creating strong visual and spatial anchors for abstract words. For example, if you're learning the word ephemeral, which means lasting for a very short time, you might visualize a beautiful ice sculpture rapidly melting on your kitchen counter.
Oh, I like that. And the more vivid and unusual the image, the better it sticks. I recently learned the word defenestration, the act of throwing someone out of a window. In my memory palace, I pictured my living room window with a tiny cartoon character being dramatically launched through it.
That's perfect. The bizarre, exaggerated nature of that image makes it memorable. And one great strategy is to build multiple memory palaces for different categories of words, maybe one for academic vocabulary, another for cooking terms, and so on.
I've started doing exactly that. I use my childhood home for emotion-related words, my college campus for academic terms, and my current apartment for everyday vocabulary. It helps keep everything organized.
That's brilliant. And once you've placed the words in your mental locations, you need to practice retrieving them regularly. I like to take mental walks through my memory palaces, stopping at each location and recalling the associated word.
Yes, I do these mental walkthroughs during my commute. It turns a boring bus ride into productive vocabulary practice. And the more I practice, the more automatic the retrieval becomes. Next, let's talk about the keyword method, which is particularly powerful for connecting words across languages.
The keyword method is fascinating. Essentially, it involves creating a phonetic and visual connection between a new word and a word you already know that sounds similar.
Right. So if you're learning that the Spanish word gato means cat, you might think of the English word got, which sounds similar. Then you create a mental image of a cat saying, "I've got to catch that mouse." The sound-alike English word becomes your keyword.
Exactly. And this works wonderfully for expanding your vocabulary within a single language too. If you're learning the English word lugubrious, which means looking sad or dismal, you might use lug as your keyword and picture someone looking depressed while lugging a heavy suitcase.
Can you walk us through the step-by-step process for generating effective keywords? I sometimes struggle with finding good sound-alike words.
Sure. First, break the unfamiliar word into syllables and find familiar words that sound like those syllables. They don't have to be perfect matches, just close enough to create a mental hook. Then create a visual scene that connects your keyword to the meaning of the new word.
I remember when I was learning that perspicacious means having keen insight or understanding. I broke it into perspicacious and used spy for the middle syllable. I imagined a detective with a magnifying glass having keen insight because he was an excellent SPY. It was ridiculous, but it worked.
That's a fantastic example. The more vivid and strange the mental image, the better it sticks. I once learned the German word Glühbirne, which means light bulb, by picturing a glowing bear. Glow sounds like glow, and burn kind of sounds like bear, with a light bulb for a head.
I love that, and I find the keyword method combines really well with other techniques we're discussing today. You can place your keyword images in your memory palace, for instance.
Absolutely. Layering multiple techniques often creates the strongest memory traces. That's something we'll talk more about later in the episode. Let's move on to visual association strategies, which tap into the brain's remarkable capacity for remembering images.
This is probably my favorite technique. Our brains are incredibly good at remembering visual information, much better than abstract text or definitions.
Exactly. The more bizarre, exaggerated, and emotionally charged your mental images are, the more memorable they become. Think about it. Which would you remember better? A dictionary definition of voracious, or an image of a tiny person devouring an entire mountain of books?
Definitely the image. I found that adding movement to these mental pictures makes them even more effective. For voracious, I might imagine the person spinning like a tornado while devouring the books.
That's brilliant. And color, too. Vibrant, unusual colors stand out in our mental landscape. For the word ebullient, which means cheerful and full of energy, I picture a person literally bubbling over with bright blue and pink bubbles bouncing up and down with joy.
I love that image. There are also some great digital tools that support visual association learning. I've been using an app that actually shows images related to vocabulary words, which gives me a starting point for creating my own associations.
Tools like that can be really helpful. Another approach is using visual hierarchies for related words. For instance, if you're learning words related to anger, you might visualize them on a thermometer with annoyed at the bottom, furious in the middle, and enraged at the top, each with its own distinct image.
That's such a smart way to organize related words. I created something similar for words describing intelligence, a staircase with clever on the first step, brilliant halfway up, and genius at the top.
Visual frameworks like that help you learn not just the words themselves, but also the relationships between them, which deepens your understanding.
Absolutely. And one tip I've found helpful is to spend a few seconds really focusing on your mental image when you create it. The more vividly you can see it in your mind's eye, the better it will stick.
That's excellent advice. Our brains are wired to prioritize what we give our full attention to, so that focused visualization time really pays off.
Now let's talk about chunking and grouping strategies, which help organize vocabulary into meaningful categories.
Chunking is incredibly powerful. Our brains can only hold about 7 items in working memory at once, but we can hack this limitation by grouping items together into meaningful chunks.
It's like how it's easier to remember a phone number as 555-123-456-7 rather than as 10 separate digits. We're applying the same principle to vocabulary learning.
Exactly. Instead of trying to learn 50 random words, we might organize them into 5 categories of 10 words each. Those categories become our chunks, making the information more manageable for our brains.
I've been using semantic mapping for this, creating visual diagrams where a central concept branches out to related words. For example, I made a map for communication with branches for written communication, verbal communication, nonverbal communication, etc.
That's a fantastic approach. I do something similar with mind maps. I recently created one for weather vocabulary with branches for different types of precipitation, wind conditions, temperatures, and so on. It helps me see how all the words relate to each other.
I find these visual organizations so helpful. Another approach I've tried is creating memory-friendly word clusters based on situations rather than strict categories, like words I might need at a business meeting or vocabulary for describing my neighborhood.
Situational clustering is so practical because it mirrors how we actually use language in real life. I've created clusters for restaurant vocabulary, airport vocabulary, emergency situation vocabulary, and so on.
And these clusters create natural review opportunities too. When I'm at a restaurant, I mentally review my restaurant vocabulary cluster. It's contextual practice that doesn't require setting aside special study time.
That's such a good point. Organizing words in meaningful ways doesn't just help with initial learning, it also facilitates ongoing review and real-world application.
Exactly. And I think the key is finding grouping methods that make intuitive sense to you personally. Some people prefer grammatical categories like adjectives and verbs, while others prefer thematic groupings like ocean words or business terms.
Absolutely. Whatever organizational system resonates with you is the right one to use. The goal is creating meaningful connections that help your brain store and retrieve information efficiently. Let's explore linking and story techniques, which are some of the most enjoyable vocabulary memory methods.
These are so much fun. Linking involves creating a chain of associations between words where each word connects to the next through a mini story or image.
It's based on the principle that our brains are naturally good at remembering sequences when there's a logical or narrative flow connecting the items. Much better than remembering random, disconnected pieces of information.
Exactly. So if I needed to learn the words ubiquitous, nefarious, quandary, and pristine, I might create a story. Cell phones are ubiquitous today, but a nefarious hacker created a quandary by threatening to steal all data unless people returned to pristine paper communication.
That's brilliant. And the more absurd or emotionally charged the story, the more memorable it becomes. I once needed to learn eloquent, vehement, taciturn, and gregarious, so I imagined an eloquent parrot having a vehement argument with a taciturn turtle, while gregarious monkeys cheered them on.
Oh, I can picture that so clearly. And what's great about these stories is that they provide context for the words, which, as we discussed in our previous episode, is crucial for true understanding.
Absolutely. And once you've created these narrative chains, you need to maintain and refresh your associations. I like to quickly run through my word stories during mundane activities like brushing my teeth or waiting for coffee.
I do something similar during my morning shower. And I find that when I need to recall one of these words later, the story comes back to me first and then leads me to the word I need. It's like following a breadcrumb trail.
That's exactly how these memory techniques work best. They create multiple pathways to the information. And the story method is particularly effective because stories engage so many parts of our brain simultaneously.
I've actually started creating little story challenges for myself, like trying to create a coherent paragraph using 5 new vocabulary words. It's a fun way to practice and strengthen those narrative associations.
That's such a creative approach. It turns vocabulary learning into a kind of game. And speaking of creative approaches, do you want to hear the most ridiculous story I ever created to remember words?
Absolutely. Let's hear it.
Well, I needed to remember cantankerous, euphoria, clandestine, and filibuster. So I imagined a cantankerous old cat experiencing euphoria after a clandestine midnight mission to filibuster the neighborhood dog council meeting. I even drew a little comic of it.
That's amazing. I can guarantee you'll never forget those words now. The zanier the story, the better it works. Now let's discuss how rhyme, rhythm, and music can be powerful memory tools for vocabulary.
This is such an interesting approach. Throughout human history, rhythm and rhyme have been used to memorize information. Think about how easily you can recall song lyrics compared to prose.
Exactly. There's something about acoustic patterns that creates strong memory hooks in our brains. I still remember all the prepositions in alphabetical order because my 5th grade teacher taught us a little song about, above, across, after, against, along.
That's the power of musical memory. I've actually created my own vocabulary songs for particularly challenging words. They're terrible songs that would make professional musicians cringe, but they work amazingly well for memory.
I'd love to hear one of these masterpieces. Would you grace us with a brief performance?
Oh gosh, put me on the spot, why don't you? Okay, here's my little jingle for remembering that mendacious means untruthful or lying. Musical note. When someone's telling lies, they're being mendacious, their stories are untruthful and quite fallacious. Musical note. Told you it was terrible.
That's not terrible. That's brilliant. And I bet you never forget what mendacious means. I've found that even creating simple rhymes can be helpful. For example, if you're feeling full of glee, you're showing great hilarity.
That's great. The rhythm in these patterns is also really important. Our brains are naturally attuned to rhythmic patterns. It's why poetry and music exist in every culture on Earth.
Exactly. And this approach is particularly powerful for audiophonic learners, people who process and retain auditory information more effectively than visual information.
Absolutely. Some people find that reciting words rhythmically while walking or jogging helps cement them in memory. The physical rhythm enhances the verbal rhythm.
I do something similar with dance. I've created little movements that go with challenging vocabulary words and practice them while playing music. My roommate thinks I've lost my mind, but it works amazingly well.
That's taking it to the next level, combining rhythm, music, and movement. Talk about multisensory learning. For our final segment, let's talk about combining methods for maximum impact.
This is where the real magic happens. Each of the techniques we've discussed is powerful on its own, but when you combine them strategically, the results can be extraordinary.
Exactly. Layering multiple memory techniques creates redundant memory pathways to the same information. If one pathway fails, you have several backups.
I find this especially helpful for those really challenging words that just won't stick no matter what I try. For instance, I struggled for ages with pusillanimouses until I combined 3 different techniques.
What approach did you use for that one?
First, I used the keyword method, breaking it into parts that sounded like pussy and animal. Then I created a visual image of a scared cartoon cat. being cowardly, which is what pusillanimous means. Finally, I place that image in a specific location in my memory palace, cowering under my desk. The combination finally made it stick.
That's the perfect example of layering techniques. I did something similar with obfuscate. I created a rhyme, placed it in my memory palace, and added a ridiculous visual of foggy smoke spelling out the word.
I think it's also important to rotate methods to prevent adaptation fatigue. Our brains are novelty seeking, so using the same technique for every word can become less effective over time.
That's such a good point. I try to use a different primary technique for each group of words I learn. Some get the story treatment, others go into the memory palace, still others get songs or rhymes.
And different types of words often benefit from different techniques. Concrete nouns are easy to visualize, so visual association works well. Abstract concepts might benefit more from stories or contextual examples.
Exactly. The key is being flexible and willing to experiment. If one approach isn't working for a particular word, try a completely different one.
And pay attention to your learning preferences too. I'm a very visual person, so imagery-based techniques work best for me, but some people are more auditory or kinesthetic learners.
That's right. The best memory technique is the one that works for you and for the specific word you're trying to learn. Don't be afraid to get creative and personalize these approaches.
Let's take a moment to summarize the key memory techniques and mnemonic systems we've discussed today.
We started with the memory palace technique, using spatial locations to anchor new vocabulary in your mind, creating multiple memory palaces for different word categories.
Then we explored the keyword method, creating phonetic and visual connections between new words and familiar ones, which works beautifully for both cross-language learning and expanding vocabulary within a single language.
We discussed visual association strategies, highlighting the power of bizarre, exaggerated imagery, and using visual hierarchies to organize related words.
We covered chunking and grouping techniques, using semantic napping and situational clustering to organize vocabulary into meaningful categories that are easier for our brains to process and remember.
We talked about linking and story techniques, creating narrative chains between words that capitalize on our brain's natural affinity for stories and sequential information.
We explored how rhyme, rhythm, and music can create powerful acoustic memory hooks, especially beneficial for audiophonic learners.
And finally, we discussed the importance of combining methods for maximum impact, layering multiple techniques for challenging words, and rotating approaches to keep your brain engaged.
What I love about all these techniques is that they transform vocabulary learning from a dry, rote memorization task into something creative, personal, and even fun.
Absolutely. And they work because they align with how our brains naturally learn and remember information through associations, stories, images, and patterns.
These techniques might feel a bit strange or even silly at first, but I encourage everyone to give them a genuine try. The results can be truly remarkable.
And remember, the goal isn't just to memorize definitions, but to create lasting, accessible memories that allow you to actually use these words in real communication. And that brings us to what we'll be covering in our next episode, integrating new words into active communication.
I'm so excited for that one. We'll be exploring strategies for moving words from passive recognition to active usage in your everyday communication.
We'll discuss the psychology of vocabulary activation, deliberate practice for speaking, writing exercises, conversation strategies, thematic word deployment, and creative expression techniques.
We'll also look at how to build sustainable usage habits to ensure the words you've learned with these memory techniques become a permanent part of your active vocabulary.
It's going to be a wonderfully practical episode filled with strategies you can start using immediately to incorporate new vocabulary into your speaking and writing. Welcome back to Vocabulary Boost. I'm Leo.
And I'm Clara. Today we're diving into episode 3 of our series on mastering 1,000 English words in 30 days.
We've covered the science of vocabulary acquisition in our first episode and powerful tech tools in our second. Today we're exploring something I personally find fascinating, contextual learning strategies for natural retention.
Oh, I'm so excited about this topic. Context is absolutely everything when it comes to actually using the words you learn. I mean, knowing a definition is one thing, but being able to use a word naturally in conversation is the real goal.
Exactly. And this episode is packed with practical strategies. We'll cover the power of learning in context, graded reading approaches, contextual immersion techniques, sentence mining, moving words from recognition to production, learning through media, and the story method.
I've been implementing so many of these methods lately and honestly seeing fantastic results. Last week, I used ubiquitouses in a presentation without even thinking about it. It just came naturally.
That's the dream, right? When words just flow without that mental dictionary lookup. So shall we jump right in?
Let's start by discussing the power of learning in context. This is really the foundation of effective vocabulary acquisition.
Absolutely. When we learn words in isolation, like just memorizing a word and its definition, we're missing out on crucial information about how the word is actually used.
Right. Studies have consistently shown that isolated word lists are actually one of the least effective ways to build long-term vocabulary. Our brains just don't retain information well when it's disconnected from meaningful context.
And there's a good reason for that. When you learn a word in context, you're not just learning its definition, you're learning its connotations, what kinds of words it pairs with, its register, whether it's formal or casual, and even subtle nuances that a dictionary definition might miss.
Exactly. Each contextual encounter creates multiple memory hooks for that word. It's like giving your brain several different ways to retrieve the same information.
I experienced this firsthand with the word egregious. I knew the definition was outstandingly bad or shocking, but I kept using it wrong because I hadn't encountered it in enough contexts to really grasp the nuance.
Oh, what happened?
I used it to describe a minor mistake in a work email. I wrote something like, "I noticed this egregious typo for a simple spelling error," and my boss later gently pointed out that egregious implies something far more serious or offensive.
Oh, no, but that's such a perfect example of the difference between knowing a definition and truly understanding usage. And that's why research so strongly supports contextual learning approaches.
The good news is there are so many effective ways to learn words in context, and we'll be exploring them throughout this episode. Let's talk about graded reading approaches, which are one of my favorite contextual learning methods.
Graded reading is fantastic. For those who aren't familiar, it involves reading materials that are specifically designed or selected to match your current vocabulary level, with just enough new words to challenge you without being overwhelming.
This relates to what language acquisition researchers call the I+1 principle, where I is your current level and +1 represents material that's just slightly beyond your comfort zone. This sweet spot is where optimal learning happens.
I love that principle. When the material is too easy, you don't learn new words. When it's too difficult, you get frustrated and can't follow the content. But that I+1 zone is where the magic happens.
There's a distinction worth making between extensive and intensive reading strategies. Extensive reading is when you read a large amount of easier material for general comprehension and enjoyment.
Like when I was learning Spanish and read young adult novels, they were simple enough that I could follow the plot, but I still encountered plenty of new vocabulary in context.
Exactly. Meanwhile, intensive reading involves working closely with more challenging texts, perhaps reading more slowly and looking up more words. Both approaches have their place in a well-rounded vocabulary strategy.
For English learners, there are so many great resources for graded reading. Websites like Newsela allow you to adjust the difficulty level of news articles, and there are entire series of graded readers from publishers like Oxford and Penguin.
And for native English speakers looking to expand their vocabulary, I recommend finding authors who use rich language but remain readable. I personally love authors like Michael Chabon or Dama Tartt, who have extensive vocabularies but write engaging stories.
Oh, I'm a huge Donna Tartt fan. Her novel, The Secret History, introduced me to so many wonderful words. I remember learning plangent from that book, such a beautiful word for a sound that's loud and resonant but with a sad quality.
That's a perfect example of contextual learning at its best. The emotional impact of the story creates strong memory associations with new vocabulary.
Let's talk about strategic contextual immersion, which takes contextual learning to the next level.
This is where you deliberately create environments that expose you to target vocabulary repeatedly in meaningful ways. Rather than random exposure, you're strategically engineering your language environment.
I've been trying this with cooking vocabulary lately. I subscribed to 3 cooking channels on YouTube, downloaded a cooking podcast, and bought a cookbook all in English. Now I'm constantly exposed to words like sauté, blanch, and reduce in various contexts.
That's brilliant. You're creating a mini immersion environment focused on a specific semantic field. How's it working for you?
It's amazing. Those cooking terms are really sticking because I'm encountering them in different contexts, but all related to the same topic. And I'm actually using them when I cook now.
That's the power of topic clusters for contextual reinforcement. When you focus on vocabulary within a specific theme, you strengthen the semantic networks in your brain. The words become interconnected rather than isolated.
Exactly. And what's great is that you can apply this approach to any area that interests you, whether it's finance, fashion, technology, sports, or medicine.
I did something similar when I became interested in photography. I intentionally exposed myself to photography books, magazines, forums, and YouTube channels. Within a few months, terms like aperture, bokeh, and exposure compensation became natural parts of my vocabulary.
It's also important to balance breadth and depth in your contextual exposure. You want enough variety of contexts to understand how words are used in different situations, but also enough repetition within those contexts for the words to stick.
That's a great point. Seeing a word in 5 different contexts is often more valuable than seeing it 5 times in the same context. Each new context adds another layer of understanding.
And this approach is so much more enjoyable than traditional vocabulary study because you're engaging with content you actually care about.
Now let's talk about sentence mining techniques, which are incredibly powerful for building a personalized collection of contextual examples.
Sentence mining is one of my absolute favorite techniques. Essentially, it involves collecting authentic example sentences containing words you want to learn.
Unlike example sentences in dictionaries, which can sometimes feel contrived, you're gathering real sentences from books, articles, conversations, places where the language is being used naturally.
And what's great is that these sentences have personal relevance because you discovered them yourself in your own reading or listening.
Exactly. The process is pretty straightforward. When you encounter a useful new word in your reading or listening, you capture not just the word, but the entire sentence that contains it.
I keep a digital sentence bank in Notion. Every time I find a great example of a word in use, I add the sentence, the source, and a quick note about why I found it noteworthy. It's become this amazing personal resource.
That's a fantastic system. I do something similar, but with physical index cards. Old school, I know, but there's something about handwriting the sentences that helps cement them in my memory.
Whatever works. There are also some great digital tools that can assist with sentence mining. Concordance tools like the COCA, Corpus of Contemporary American English, let you search for words and see how they're used in real contexts across different types of media.
Those corpus tools are amazing for seeing patterns in how words are actually used. You might discover, for instance, that a particular adjective tends to appear with certain nouns, or that a verb is often used in passive constructions.
Exactly. And these patterns are something you'd never pick up from just learning a definition. Like, I noticed from my sentence mining that the word pernicious almost always describes abstract rather than concrete things. Pernicious effects influence beliefs, but rarely physical objects.
That's such a valuable insight, and it's exactly the kind of nuance that helps you use words naturally rather than awkwardly.
Sentence mining also gives you ready-made examples to use in your own speaking and writing. Instead of constructing sentences from scratch, you have authentic models to work from. Let's address what I think is one of the biggest challenges in vocabulary acquisition, moving from recognition to production.
This is such an important topic. Many learners experience what linguists call the recognition production gap, where they can understand a word when they read or hear it, but can't actually use it themselves in speaking or writing.
I definitely struggled with this. I would recognize hundreds of words while reading, but when it came time to speak or write, I would default to the same basic vocabulary I always used.
That's totally normal. Production requires a higher level of word knowledge and confidence than recognition. When we recognize a word, we just need to match it to its meaning. But to produce it, we need to know its precise meaning, pronunciation, spelling, grammar patterns, collocations.
And we need to retrieve all that information in real time during conversation, which is cognitively demanding. So how do we bridge this gap?
One effective approach is to use scaffolded exercises that gradually increase in difficulty. You might start with gap fills, where you insert the target word into a sentence, then move to sentence completion, and finally to creating original sentences.
I've found it helpful to do what I call sentence transformations, taking a sentence with a target word and rewriting it in different tenses, or changing it from positive to negative, or from a question to a statement. It builds flexibility with the word.
That's brilliant. Another powerful technique is self-testing through active recall. Instead of just reviewing words and their meanings, try to generate sentences using those words without looking at examples.
Yes, And if you're brave enough, recording yourself speaking can be eye-opening. I used to record myself trying to use new vocabulary in short monologues. It was painfully awkward at first, but it quickly highlighted which words I was comfortable producing and which ones I wasn't.
The key is creating opportunities for meaningful output. Writing in a journal using target vocabulary, explaining concepts to yourself using new words, or participating in discussions where you can incorporate recently learned terms.
I've even started deliberately using one new word in every work email I send. It's a small thing, but it gives me regular production practice in a low-pressure context.
That's such a clever idea. The more we actively produce vocabulary, the lower the activation threshold becomes until eventually the words flow naturally without conscious effort. Let's explore how we can build vocabulary through media consumption, movies, TV shows, podcasts, and audiobooks.
This is where vocabulary learning gets really fun. These media forms provide rich contextual learning opportunities, plus the benefit of hearing words pronounced correctly.
Exactly. For movies and TV shows, I've found that using English subtitles with English audio is incredibly effective. You're simultaneously hearing and reading the words, which creates stronger memory associations.
Yes. And what's great about visual media is that you get additional contextual cues from the setting, actors' expressions, and the situation, all of which help anchor new vocabulary in your memory.
I've been watching this British baking show lately, and it's amazing how many baking terms I've picked up just from the visual demonstrations paired with the dialogue. Words like proving, fondant, and ganache make so much more sense when you can actually see what they refer to.
That visual association is so powerful. For podcasts and audiobooks, transcripts can be really helpful. I like to listen once for general comprehension, then follow along with the transcript on a second listen to catch words I didn't recognize.
That's a great approach. And speaking of audiobooks, did you know services like Audible often let you slow down the playback speed? That can be really helpful for catching every word, especially with narrators who speak quickly.
I use that feature all the time. But the key with all these media forms is to find ways to engage actively rather than passively consume. Otherwise, the vocabulary might just wash over you without sticking.
What are some active engagement strategies you found effective?
I like to pause and repeat interesting phrases aloud or jot down unfamiliar words to look up later. Sometimes I'll even pause a show and try to predict what a character might say next, using the vocabulary from the show.
Those are great ideas. I've started keeping a media vocabulary journal where I note down interesting words or expressions from whatever I'm watching or listening to, along with the context. It's become this fascinating collection of language from different genres and periods.
That sounds amazing. And don't forget how certain shows or genres have their own specialized vocabulary: legal dramas, medical shows, science fiction. If you have specific vocabulary goals, you can choose media that aligns with those interests. Our final contextual learning strategy is the story method for word retention, which harnesses the power of narrative to make vocabulary memorable.
This is such a fascinating approach. Humans are naturally wired for stories. We've been telling them for thousands of years, and our brains are specially adapted to remember narrative information.
Exactly. The story method involves creating micro-narratives that connect new words in memorable ways. Instead of learning words as isolated units, you weave them into small stories that create stronger memory traces.
For example, if you're trying to learn the words benevolent, conspicuous, and dwindle, you might create a quick story. The benevolent king made a conspicuous entrance into the village, unaware that his popularity would soon dwindle due to his new tax policies.
Oh, I love that. The narrative creates connections between the words and embeds them in a meaningful context. I found this especially helpful for learning words with similar meanings that I might otherwise confuse.
Right. Like creating a story that uses frugal, thrifty, economical, and sparing all in different ways that highlight their subtle differences.
Visualization is another powerful component of the story method. When you create these micro-narratives, try to visualize the scenes vividly in your mind. This engages more of your brain in the learning process.
I actually close my eyes sometimes and try to see the story playing out like a little movie in my head. The more detailed and bizarre the visualization, the more memorable it becomes.
Yes, and don't be afraid to make your stories absurd or emotionally charged. Those qualities make them more memorable. I once created a ridiculous story about a loquacious parrot who was berating a stoic cat at a clandestine poker game.
That's brilliant. Did it help you remember those words?
Absolutely. It's been years, and I still remember that silly visual. It's much more effective than trying to memorize Loquacious means talkative in isolation.
Another benefit of the story method is that it allows you to practice using words in context right from the start. You're not just memorizing definitions, you're actually crafting meaningful sentences with the words.
And that builds a bridge to actually using these words in real conversations later on. The stories serve as a kind of rehearsal for real world language use.
We've covered so many powerful contextual learning strategies today. Let's summarize the key points before we wrap up.
We started by explaining why context is so crucial for vocabulary acquisition, how it creates multiple memory hooks and teaches you how words are actually used, not just what they mean.
Then we explored graded reading approaches, using the I+1 principle to find materials that are challenging enough to teach you new words, but not so difficult that they overwhelm you.
We discussed strategic contextual immersion, creating many environments focused on specific topics to strengthen semantic networks and encounter vocabulary repeatedly in meaningful contexts.
We covered sentence mining techniques for collecting authentic examples of words in use, which helps you understand usage patterns and provides models for your own language production.
We talked about bridging the recognition production gap through scaffolded exercises, active recall, and creating regular opportunities for meaningful output.
We explored how to build vocabulary through media consumption, turning passive activities like watching TV or listening to podcasts into active learning opportunities.
And finally, we discussed the story method, creating micro-narratives that connect new words in memorable ways, using visualization and emotional resonance to strengthen retention.
The beauty of all these contextual strategies is that they make vocabulary acquisition more natural, more effective, and ultimately more enjoyable than rote memorization.
Absolutely. And they're designed to ensure that the words you learn become part of your active vocabulary, words you can actually use, not just recognize.
In our next episode, we'll be exploring memory techniques and mnemonic systems, powerful methods specifically adapted for vocabulary acquisition.
We'll dive into fascinating techniques like the memory palace for vocabulary, the keyword method, visual association strategies, chunking, linking, and how music and rhythm can boost retention.
It's going to be an incredibly practical episode filled with techniques you can start using immediately to dramatically improve your word retention and recall speed.
Thank you so much for joining us for episode 3 of Vocabulary Boost. If you found these contextual learning strategies helpful, please share this episode with friends who might also benefit from expanding their vocabulary.
And we'd love to hear which of these strategies you try and how they work for you. Until next time, happy word learning in context. Welcome back to Vocabulary Boost. I'm Leo.
And I'm Clara. Today, we're continuing our journey through rapid vocabulary acquisition with episode 5, integrating new words into active communication.
In our previous episodes, we've explored the science of vocabulary acquisition, powerful tech tools, contextual learning strategies, and memory techniques. Now we're focusing on something really practical, how to actually use all those words you've been learning.
Yes, this is where the rubber meets the road. It's one thing to recognize words when you see them, but quite another to confidently pull them out of your mental lexicon during a conversation or while writing.
Absolutely. Today we'll cover strategies for bridging the passive-active vocabulary gap, deliberate practice for speaking, writing exercises, conversation strategies, thematic word deployment, creative expression techniques, and building sustainable usage habits.
I'm particularly excited about this topic because just last week, I managed to naturally use quintessential in a work presentation without even thinking about it. It was such a satisfying moment.
That's the dream, when words just flow naturally without that mental dictionary lookup. So let's dive in and help our listeners achieve those same satisfying moments.
Let's start by discussing the psychology of bridging the passive-active vocabulary gap.
This is such a crucial concept. Many language learners have experienced that frustrating situation where they recognize thousands of words when reading or listening, but when it comes time to speak or write, they can only access a fraction of those words.
Yes, and there's solid psychology behind this phenomenon. It's all about the difference between recognition and recall memory. Recognition is when you see or hear something and remember it, while recall is when you have to retrieve information from memory without external cues.
Exactly. And recall is significantly more demanding cognitively. It's like the difference between recognizing someone's face in a crowd versus trying to describe their features to a sketch artist without any visual reference.
That's such a good analogy. And then there's what linguists call the production effect, the observation that saying words aloud leads to better memory than simply reading them silently.
This makes so much sense. When you speak a word, you're engaging motor memory in addition to semantic memory. You're literally creating multiple neural pathways to the same information.
I've experienced this firsthand. Words I've practiced saying aloud stick much better than ones I've only read. Like the word serendipitous, I practiced saying it in different sentences about 10 times, and now it pops into my mind whenever an opportunity to use it arises.
There's also this concept of a retrieval threshold that's really helpful to understand. Each word in your mental lexicon has a certain activation level. Words need to exceed a certain threshold to be accessible for production.
Right. And frequent words like happy or beautiful naturally have high activation levels because we encounter and use them constantly. But rarer words like jubilant or resplendent might sit below that threshold unless we deliberately work to activate them.
The good news is there are specific strategies to lower that activation energy, essentially making words more accessible for spontaneous use. And that's what the rest of today's episode is about. Let's talk about deliberate practice for speaking. This is all about intentionally creating opportunities to use your target vocabulary out loud.
Yes, and the key word here is deliberate. It's not just about general speaking practice, but specifically designing practice sessions that target the vocabulary you want to activate.
Exactly. One approach I've found incredibly effective is creating personalized speaking drills. I select 5 to 10 target words and challenge myself to use each one in 3 different sentences, speaking them aloud with confidence.
I do something similar, but I also record myself, which was terrifying at first, but it's so helpful for spotting when I'm using words awkwardly or with the wrong intonation.
Recording yourself is powerful. It creates this accountability that's hard to get otherwise. Have you tried the shadowing technique as well? That's been a game changer for me.
Oh, shadowing is fantastic. For listeners who aren't familiar, shadowing involves listening to a native speaker using your target vocabulary and then immediately repeating what they say, mimicking their intonation and rhythm as closely as possible.
It helps you internalize natural usage patterns. I was struggling with how to use ostensibly in conversation until I started shadowing examples. Now it flows much more naturally.
Another approach I've found helpful is gradually increasing speaking complexity. I start with simple sentences using my target words, then progress to more complex sentences, and finally to stringing multiple sentences together into a mini monologue.
That's such a smart progression. It's like weight training for your vocabulary. You're gradually building up strength and fluency.
Exactly. And don't forget about self-analysis. After practicing, take a moment to reflect on which words felt comfortable and which ones still feel awkward or unnatural. Those are the ones that need more deliberate practice. Writing exercises are another powerful way to integrate new vocabulary into active use.
Absolutely. Writing gives you more time to consciously retrieve and apply vocabulary compared to speaking, which makes it an excellent intermediary step in the activation process.
I've found sentence creation challenges really effective. I'll select 5 to 10 target words and write one sentence with each. It sounds simple, but it forces you to think about context, collocations, and grammar.
I like to take that a step further with paragraph construction. I challenge myself to use 3 to 5 target words in a coherent paragraph about a specific topic. It pushes me to use the words naturally rather than forcing them in.
That's a great approach. I've actually started keeping a vocabulary journal where I write a daily entry incorporating at least 3 new words I'm trying to activate. It creates this wonderful record of my language growth.
I love that idea. And have you tried getting feedback on your writing? That's been crucial for me. Sometimes I think I'm using a word correctly, but a native speaker points out subtle issues with my usage.
Yes, I have a language exchange partner who reviews my writing once a week. Her feedback has been invaluable, especially for words with cultural nuances that dictionaries don't fully capture.
Dictionaries can only take you so far. I learned this the hard way when I used notorious to describe a famous restaurant, not realizing it has negative connotations. My writing partner gently pointed out that I probably meant renowned instead.
Oh no. But that's actually the perfect example of why feedback is so important. These subtle distinctions are often only apparent when you try to use words actively and get expert guidance.
Exactly. And don't forget the power of revision. I often go back and revise my writing to incorporate more sophisticated vocabulary. It's a great way to practice upgrading basic words to more precise or nuanced alternatives.
That's such a good strategy. I sometimes challenge myself to revise a paragraph without changing the meaning, just elevating the vocabulary. It's like giving your writing a lexical makeover.
Now let's talk about conversation strategies for integrating new vocabulary into your speaking.
This is where many learners struggle the most, actually using their vocabulary in real-time, unpredictable conversations.
Absolutely. One strategy I found incredibly helpful is preparing conversation topics in advance with target vocabulary. If I know I'm going to discuss environmental issues with someone, I'll review relevant vocabulary beforehand.
I do something similar. I actually keep topic-specific vocabulary lists in my phone. Before a meeting about marketing strategy, for instance, I'll quickly review terms like demographic, conversion rate, and brand positioning.
That's brilliant. It's like a chef prepping ingredients before cooking. You want your vocabulary readily accessible when you need it.
Language exchange sessions are also fantastic for vocabulary practice. I meet weekly with a partner specifically to practice using new vocabulary in conversation.
How does that work exactly? Do you tell them which words you're trying to practice?
I do. I share my list of target words at the beginning of our session, and my partner listens for them. They'll create natural opportunities for me to use them, and they also give me feedback on my usage.
That's fantastic. Of course, even with preparation, we sometimes forget words mid-conversation. I've developed some recovery strategies for those moments.
Oh, I need those. What do you do when a word escapes you?
I have practiced a few phrases like, I'm thinking of a specific word that means, or there's a precise term for this that's escaping me right now. These buy me time without breaking the flow of conversation.
I like that approach. I sometimes quickly substitute a synonym while making a mental note to look up the exact word I wanted later. The key is not letting vocabulary gaps destroy your confidence.
Exactly. Confidence is so crucial. Many people hold back from using new vocabulary because they're afraid of making mistakes, but those mistakes are actually essential to the learning process.
Absolutely. I made some truly embarrassing vocabulary errors when I first started trying to use advanced words, but each mistake taught me something, and now those words are firmly in my active vocabulary. Let's discuss thematic word deployment, focusing on one semantic field at a time to make vocabulary activation more manageable.
This is such a practical approach. Instead of trying to activate hundreds of random words simultaneously, you focus on words that are related to each other and likely to be used in the same contexts.
Exactly. For example, last month I focused on academic discussion vocabulary, words like paradigm, empirical, methodology, and discourse. Since they all relate to the same context, they reinforced each other.
That makes so much sense. I did something similar with descriptive vocabulary for architecture after visiting some historic buildings. I focused on terms like facade, ornate, symmetrical, and grandeur all at once.
Creating opportunities to use domain-specific vocabulary is key. Did you find ways to practice those architecture terms?
I did. I actually gave a short presentation at a dinner party about historic buildings in our city, which gave me the perfect excuse to use all those terms naturally. My friends probably thought I suddenly became an architecture buff overnight.
That's perfect. I've found that writing reviews is great for practicing domain-specific vocabulary, too. Restaurant reviews for food vocabulary, book reviews for literary terms, product reviews for descriptive adjectives.
Those are excellent suggestions. Another approach I like is topic rotation, focusing on one semantic field for 1 to 2 weeks, then switching to a new one. It prevents boredom while ensuring each set of words gets enough focused practice.
I do something similar. Right now I'm working on emotional vocabulary, but next week I'll switch to business terminology. It keeps things fresh while still providing enough repetition for words to stick.
And for each thematic set, it's helpful to imagine real-world scenarios where you'd use those words. For weather vocabulary, you might practice describing the forecast or extreme weather events.
Yes. Role-playing those scenarios, even just in your head, creates mental pathways that make the vocabulary more accessible when you actually need it.
Now let's explore creative expression techniques for vocabulary integration.
This is where vocabulary practice becomes really fun. Instead of dry exercises, you're using new words for genuine self-expression and creativity.
Exactly. Storytelling is one of my favorite techniques. I challenge myself to tell a complete story using 5 to 7 target vocabulary words. It forces me to use the words in context while creating something entertaining.
I love that. I actually started a little writing circle with friends where we each contribute target words, then write short stories incorporating all of them. It's hilarious what people come up with when trying to use ephemeral, clandestine, and boisterous in the same story.
That sounds like so much fun. Have you tried role-playing scenarios as well?
Yes. Role-playing is perfect for practicing vocabulary in specific contexts. I recently did a job interview role-play to practice professional vocabulary. My friend was the interviewer, and I had to incorporate words like proficient, initiative, and collaborative into my responses.
That's such practical preparation. I've found creative writing prompts incredibly useful too. Something like write a description of a forest using these 5 target adjectives, or compose a persuasive paragraph using these transition words.
Writing prompts are fantastic. They provide just enough structure to focus your vocabulary use without being restrictive. I actually keep a jar of prompts on my desk and pull one out whenever I have 15 minutes to spare.
What a great idea. I might steal that one from you. Another approach I enjoy is using humor and wordplay to reinforce vocabulary, creating puns or jokes with my target words.
Humor is so powerful for memory. I still remember the ridiculous pun I made with juxtaposition years ago. It was terrible, but the word has been firmly in my active vocabulary ever since.
Now you have to share this terrible pun.
Oh, goodness. Okay. I said something about how my cat and dog sleeping next to each other was a perfect juxtaposition. I told you it was terrible.
That's gloriously bad. But if it helped you remember the word, that's all that matters. The sillier and more personal these creative exercises are, the more memorable they become.
Exactly. And that personal connection is what transforms vocabulary from something you've memorized to something you genuinely own and can use with confidence. Our final topic is building sustainable usage habits, how to make vocabulary activation an ongoing part of your language practice.
This is so important. All the activation strategies we've discussed are only effective if they're applied consistently over time.
Absolutely. Creating a personal review and usage system is key. I have what I call my vocabulary activation workflow, a systematic approach to moving words from passive to active.
I'd love to hear how that works.
Sure. When I identify a word I want to activate, it goes through 4 stages. First, I create flashcards with example sentences. Second, I practice using it in writing. Third, I incorporate it into speaking exercises. And finally, I look for opportunities to use it naturally in conversation.
That's a wonderfully structured approach. Do you track words as they move through these stages?
I do. I have a simple spreadsheet with columns for each stage. It's so satisfying to see words progress from learning to active use, and it helps me balance new acquisition with activation practice.
Finding that balance is crucial. It's tempting to keep learning new words without properly activating the ones you already know.
Exactly. I follow the 1 to 3 rule. For every new word I learn, I spend time activating 3 words I already know. It prevents my passive vocabulary from getting too far ahead of my active vocabulary.
That's brilliant. Setting realistic usage goals is also important. I aim to actively use 5 target words each day, whether in writing, speaking practice, or real conversation.
5 words a day is a great target. I do something similar with a weekly goal of 25 words. I track them in a little notebook, which has become this wonderful record of my vocabulary growth over time.
I love that tracking approach. It's so motivating to see tangible evidence of your progress. And it helps identify patterns, like maybe you're successfully activating adjectives but struggling with abstract nouns.
Exactly. Tracking helped me realize I was avoiding phrasal verbs in my active speech. Once I identified that pattern, I could specifically target those for activation practice.
That kind of self-awareness is invaluable. The key to sustainable vocabulary growth is creating habits that you can maintain long-term without burning out.
Absolutely. It's better to spend 10 minutes daily on focused activation than to do marathon 2-hour sessions that you can't sustain. Consistency beats intensity every time when it comes to vocabulary acquisition.
Let's take a moment to summarize the key strategies we've covered today for integrating new words into active communication.
We started by discussing the psychology of bridging the passive-active vocabulary gap, understanding the production effect, and the concept of retrieval threshold that explains why recognition is easier than recall.
Then we explored deliberate practice for speaking, creating personalized speaking drills, using the shattering technique, recording yourself, and gradually increasing complexity to build confidence.
We covered writing exercises for vocabulary integration, sentence creation challenges, paragraph construction, journaling with target words, and the importance of getting feedback on your written production.
We discussed conversation strategies, preparing topic-specific vocabulary in advance, utilizing language exchange opportunities, and developing techniques for recovering gracefully when you forget a word.
We talked about thematic word deployment, focusing on one semantic field at a time, creating opportunities to use domain-specific vocabulary, and rotating topics to ensure comprehensive practice.
We explored creative expression techniques, using storytelling, role-playing scenarios, creative writing prompts, and even humor to make vocabulary activation more engaging and memorable.
And finally, we discussed building sustainable usage habits, creating a personal review system, balancing new acquisition with activation practice, setting realistic usage goals, and tracking your active vocabulary growth.
Throughout all these strategies, the common thread is intentionality, being deliberate about moving words from passive recognition to active usage through consistent, varied practice.
Exactly. Active vocabulary development isn't something that happens automatically. It requires conscious effort and regular practice, but the results are so worth it, being able to express yourself precisely and confidently.
And remember that activation is a gradual process. Words typically don't go from completely passive to fully active overnight. There's a spectrum of accessibility, and each practice session moves words further along that spectrum.
That's such an important point. Be patient with yourself and celebrate every time you successfully use a new word naturally in conversation. Those little wins add up to significant progress over time. Next time, we'll be concluding our series with Episode 6, Maintaining and Expanding Your Vocabulary Beyond 30 Days.
We'll explore long-term retention strategies, how to prevent vocabulary attrition, advanced expansion techniques, and ways to integrate vocabulary learning with your broader language goals.
We'll also discuss methods for tracking and celebrating your progress over the long term, which is so important for staying motivated on your vocabulary journey.
It's going to be the perfect capstone to our series, focusing on how to make vocabulary growth a sustainable, lifelong practice rather than just a 30-day challenge.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode on integrating new words into active communication. If you found these strategies helpful, please share this episode with friends who might also benefit from boosting their vocabulary.
And we'd love to hear about your experiences trying these techniques. Which activation strategies work best for you? Is there a particular word you're proud of adding to your active vocabulary recently?
Until next time, keep practicing, stay positive, and happy word activating. Remember, every conversation is an opportunity to strengthen your vocabulary muscles.